This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today we're talking about the movie The Lives of the Others from 2006. It's a German movie, and its German name is Das Leben der Anderen. And we are joined by Travis Dow. Travis is really the podcasting man of all seasons. He is the host of countless podcasts, including, but not limited to, The History of Germany, The History of Alchemy, Bohemican, The History of Africa, and the German language podcast, Americana for Euch. Is that how you would say it?
That's right, yeah. Very good.
Did I catch all of them, Travis?
I think so. Who's counting?
Close.
Who's counting? Yeah.
Travis, thank you so much for being on. I thought this movie is perfect for you. I really felt like even watching this movie, I was like, Travis is the perfect guy for this movie.
Yeah, and this is a movie that gripped me. Like, yeah, definitely very interesting movie. And I grew up in Germany and lived in Prague. And this movie was kind of like, you know, and I moved to Prague for the curiosity of like living on the other side, you know, the life of the others, to see what that was like and how the city's changing and all that. And, you know, what are they doing now? Czech Republic's a new country. And this type of movie just feeds into my curiosity of, you know, how it was. And I eat it up for sure. Yep.
This movie was released in 2009, but it's set in the East Germany of the mid-1980s, really at the tail end of the Cold War, just a few years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as we usually do, we're going to use this movie as a way to get into a deeper conversation about East Germany and the Eastern Bloc countries, as well as how these countries progressed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a critical element of this movie, The Lives of the Others. Mm-hmm. Just some production details about the movie. The director and writer was Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck. It's a German language film, but it is available with English subtitles. It got a really high Rotten Tomatoes of 93% and a Metacritic of 89%, which I think is the highest of any movie we've done so far. It was filmed throughout Berlin, which we will talk quite a bit about. It has a runtime of 137 minutes. It was the 2006 winner of the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and it won just a pile of German and European awards on top of that. The movie does have a very high-powered German cast, but most of these actors I don't think wouldn't be readily recognizable for most American audiences or non-German audiences. Ulrich Mühe, some of these names are going to stretch my rudimentary German skills.
Ulrich Mühe, yeah.
He plays Captain Gerd Wiesler, and he's a Stasi officer. He's kind of a disaffected and burdened by the work that he has to do for the Stasi. And Mühe was actually an East German. And there was another actor, Sebastian Koch, and he plays an actor and filmmaker / stage writer named Georg Dreimann.
Yeah.
And he's actually a famous German actor, Koch. He might be recognizable as a bit role on the TV show Homeland for some playing at home.
Okay, right, okay. Interesting, yeah.
Then the only other actor from the film that might be semi-recognizable is Martina Gedeck. She's been in a few English language movies, but not very many. Travis, can you just set up a little bit of the context of the mid-'80s in Germany, of what this movie's trying to get us into?
Yeah, it's basically... Oh, there's a bunch of themes here. There's a bunch of kind of ideas it's trying to portray, but most simply put, it's showing the Stasi, which is the East German state police, like the secret police kind of, their power of observation and of like spying on their own citizens and censorship. And there's this in communist Germany, there was this whole idea that the artists should toe the party line. I mean, I think this is pretty widely known, but it was in East Germany was very strict as far as like monitoring their own citizens. And I don't know if we want to. I have some things written down of what the Stasi did, but we can kind of circle back to that. But that's one of the themes is art and artists in communist Germany when they can't do and say whatever they want. And in this case, it's an artist like specifically doing something for a West German newspaper and trying to publish censored data. And I don't know. Do you want that's a major plot point? Should we already like reveal like what the main point of the movie is, kind of?
Maybe let's talk a little bit first about just that general setting.
Yeah, it's East Germany. It's the Stasi. The whole movie is about, the Stasi spying on an artist, and the whole idea of the secret police, the whole idea of East Berlin and West Berlin, and that whole cat and mouse game of trying to smuggle information to the West, and the paranoia of it all. So that everybody, because one of the themes is informants, who's informing on who. And I actually looked that up, is like how prevalent that was in East Germany, and how many informants the Stasi had and all that, because that was a real issue, and that's a real issue that Germans did. This whole movie deals with real issues that Germans had to struggle with after the reunification. The idea of forgiveness between victim and perpetrator. So it's that context, that paranoid living in a communist, totalitarian government, and trying to do something good at one's great personal risk, trying to get information out to the West. It's very Cold War. It's, if you like the whole Cold War aspect of it, and secret police and drama and this and that, it's got a couple very like high-paced moments of the James Bond kind of sneaking a tiny typewriter around and sneaking. I mean, all just it's that kind of that kind of movie and that kind of like Cold War environment for sure.
That's what I thought was kind of interesting about the movie, is that it was set in 1984, but it looked like it might have been the 60s or even the 1950s. Like it was old technology, dreary empty seats, street scenes. Was that an accurate portrayal from what you know?
That's really, so that's actually a really interesting point to bring up, and we definitely should. What are you also doing an episode on like Goodbye Lenin? Can we freely compare this to those kind of movies, or because I'm asking because Goodbye Lenin got some criticism of nostalgia, of looking back with rose-tinted glasses and being kind of nostalgic about, the way, life was simpler, and, maybe we didn't have a car, but, it was rent controlled, and bread was price controlled, and butter, milk and all these things was price controlled, and we got by, and we were happy. And the fact is that there was a suppression. Now, okay, to put a kind of finer point on it, this movie specifically was depicting some things from the 1960s, like late 50s and 60s, very accurately, that weren't quite as accurate in the 1980s. One concrete example was at the very beginning, you see a torture scene, and they're using like sleep deprivation. He's been up for a couple of days, and they're getting him to talk, and then they're using this as a teaching tool in school. The Stasi leader is playing playing the tape in a classroom setting, and these children are like, and these children are arguing. Actually, that's a great scene. So, they're showing this, and one child says, "Isn't that inhumane?" And the Stasi guy, the teacher, just kind of looks and makes a little mark by his name on the cheating. I mean, it's just like, wow. Yeah. Now, my point is that in the 50s and 60s, they would have used those kind of methods, and they even really went to torture. But the Germans say, I don't know if the Germans say, but it is a saying that the Gestapo broke bones, the Stasi broke spirits. And in the 1980s, the Stasi would use solitary confinement a lot, but actually less drastic and more direct forms of, duress, of torture. Sleep deprivation is really, they stopped kind of doing that basically. And so they kind of mixed some of the era and this and that. The way the Stasi functioned, I think, I believe I read was very, late 1950s, 1960s. They kind of backed off. The Communist Party was more self-aware in the 80s. So they kind of knew that they were being seen with a lot of paranoia and all this. So the degree of having these informants around was actually kind of overblown a little bit. It wasn't. A fact is that in East Germany, most people just lived their lives. They were neither a victim of the Stasi, nor were they an informant of the Stasi. The vast majority of East Germans were just simply people trying to get by, So this movie kind of portrays, and a lot of movies about this period portray like everybody as a victim or everybody as a perpetrator. And if you think about that, this movie's like, yeah, the girlfriend's an informant, the guy's a victim, so there's nobody innocent, really. The kid that speaks up in class is instantly a victim, but yeah, it's also noted that otherwise, yeah, you drop the rose-tinted glasses, this is a hard, realistic look and praised as the first serious film on the matter. I've seen several Czech films also kind of making fun of the communist times, either painting the Stasi or secret police of whatever country as buffoons and kind of stupid and bumbling around, and it's the sneaky pro-democracy folks that are, they're conniving and clever, and this movie is much more realistic of human versus human, in the system of communism of East Germany, but yeah, much more balanced, much more, it's darker, it's not a comedy. So yeah, in that regard, I could say I've read a lot of criticism saying that it was very realistic, like positive criticism.
It's interesting you should say that most people weren't involved in surveillance one way or the other.
Sure, yeah.
In this movie, the surveillance was very personal. I mean, the Captain Wiesman literally was listening to them through the attic of their apartment. And in America lately, we've been a little, there's been talk about surveillance and, that they may have been trolling something like metadata, but this is really personal stuff here, that there's a guy literally, he's in your attic and he's listening to your conversations and when they're having relations and like all that stuff.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And this is something that perhaps Eastern Germany is unfortunately the best at. The Stasi actually did survey. They kept an eye on a higher percentage of the population than any other totalitarian government. And I think people might have room to argue or something depending on how you define that, but especially given the technology at the time. But as far as just phone tapping, just wiretapping, the Stasi, given their methods, they had the highest percentage of people just listening in on the phone, and they had some of that automated, which is pretty impressive for the day. And now, someone sitting in someone's attic, I read pretty clear criticism that that's not quite the way that happened, because you would hear the typewriter, hey, there's somebody in my ceiling, typing away. But indeed, like the role played by two Stasi guys, would have really been done by like 5 people and kind of more split up and this and that. But overall, the methods, were pretty spot on, at least for the 60s and 70s. Again, not necessarily always for the 80s. But yes, they were watched. Really, I want to say fun fact, but it's not really fun at all. So the way the Stasi operated a lot of times was through blackmail. So not only were they brutally efficient, I shouldn't say this, the way only Germans can be. That's a compliment. But they were brutally efficient in the way that they ran their organization. But also, their game was blackmail. So they would break into your apartment, and there's websites out there of, I forget what, I should have looked that up. There's a website out there of just things that from Stasi folders of them just going, taking pictures, breaking into an apartment and just gathering evidence. So they open a drawer and take there's Marlboro cigarettes. That's a Western brand, which means they got it illegally somehow. There's ways to get Coca-Cola and Marlboro and Time magazine and all that, but it's not easy to do. You'd have to go through a one of those special stores where only, they accept dollars and this kind of thing. And it was really hard to do, which means probably there was something illegal somewhere, so you'd open a closet, like a clothes closet, and on the inside there'd be a Beatles poster or an Elvis poster. And you can go to these websites today and just see the Stasi files for all these people, and you're just like, oh wow, it's funny what they gathered as evidence. And 9 times out of 10, that file sits in a Stasi building somewhere, and the person doesn't even know it exists. However, that one time when they step out of line, they say, actually, you better, you've been making a lot of phone calls to Paris and we know about it, and you better stop, because if not, we're going to start moving against you for this and this. And, we found the Coca-Cola bottles in your fridge or whatever. And in that regard, in the whole, okay, what do you do if you're in front of the Stasi? What if you're a target? And it could be for anything, because if you're looking for Coca-Cola, if you're looking for magazines, just anything can be. If your radio station is tuned to the wrong channel, a Western station, or they turn on the TV and that's tuned into a German or Austrian channel, that's already, so you have something. So if you get a phone call to the Stasi, and this is actually in the movie, I'm going to kind of go over a scene here, and if you get a phone call and they bring you in, and they say, well, they ask you, what have you done? And what are you going to do? You're going to try to pull a bluff at first. And, in the movie, he says, I haven't done anything. And then the reply was, well, then why are you here? And the guy's like, I don't know. And, the guy looks at him, in uniform, the officer looks at him and says, you think we would bring you here if you haven't done anything? If you, and by the way, here's the punchline. If you suspect the state of such behavior, that's enough reason to bring you here. So in 2 sentences, you just incriminated yourself, because, without even, you don't know what your crime is. What, do you think we've made a mistake? That's a crime. So now we'll just add that to the list. It's that kind of, it's just, you're walking on eggshells. If they have you on a list, there's no way around it. There's nothing you can really do to get out of that situation. That is what a totalitarian government does. That's the nightmarish aspect of that kind of thing.
That's what I think this movie really burrowed down to, is that people don't want to be guilty of things. People generally want to follow the rules. And when every rule is easily broken and there's a rule against everything, then you live in perpetual guilt.
Yeah, in a way, exactly. Yep. So that whole, that whole aspect of life in East Germany was definitely portrayed very well, I'd say. The whole hopelessness of it. If you're sitting in front of a Stasi officer at the interrogation room, or even in their office, that's it. That's the beginning of the end. And it's very Gestapo-ish. It's very if they already know who you are, if they already bring you in for questioning, it's already too late.
Here's something that might be a little controversial. How accustomed were people at that point to Gestapo-type techniques? Was this something that people were very, I wouldn't say indoctrinated to, but they were comfortable with it, and they knew that this was what the deal was?
I think that's a problem that got worse and worse from the government's point of view, is that the government kind of started to dawn on them that the vast population sees them as the bad guys. And they made fun of this in Goodbye Lenin. It's socialism with a face. That was Honecker's Sozialismus. Yeah, that it was the people saw socialism as Big Brother, as the evil, overlord and this oppressive government. And socialists themselves, I mean, they didn't see themselves as the bad guy. That they saw themselves as trying to make life better, and whatever a politician probably thinks, or a good politician thinks on some level. And so it's a problem that became apparent. I think in the early days it was always there. There were always anti-communists and this and that, but it was much more underlying. There was in the 50s, there was so much more of that paranoia. There was so much more of that being double-faced because you didn't know who an informant was. And it turns out there were less informants than people thought there were. But these rumors, I mean, it was all a propaganda mill. It was all the ideas were power, really. So if you thought that every fourth person was a informant, then you kept your mouth shut. And if you kept your mouth shut, then that means even to people you trusted, you probably didn't say certain things. And well, that's all the government really wanted in the first place. So it's interesting. I wonder, because not having actually lived in any communist country. Technically, I lived in a communist country, but the socialist and communist parties did a coalition, but it was still a democratically elected communist party. But it wasn't. I never lived in a totalitarian country, and I think that's the difference. Is the rumors would be, someone you just in the schoolyard, you're sitting, have you? Because I heard this rumor. I grew up believing that the Stasi bugged 100% of all phones, and that. They were smart enough that if you said a buzzword like Paris or dollar or, Budweiser or whatever it is, Coca-Cola, then it goes click and a tape starts recording. And now I'm pretty sure, because I've been to enough communist museums in that part of the world, that that's not really true. They did have a lot of wire taps, and they could listen into any call. So technically 100% are, but it was kind of overblown, and a lot of people. Does that matter? Because if you thought that the government could do that, then you acted as if they could. When in fact they weren't, the other side, in the comedies, they portray them as bumbling idiots. And if you go to the museum in Berlin, you see these ladders and trabants that are hollowed out where they would hide bodies and people smuggled over the border and this and that, and hundreds made it. And you think, well, how stupid were the guards? And then you realize that, for every person that made it, how many hundreds were, how many people were shot? Mm-hmm. And they're not as stupid as they, it's not as stupid as they're portrayed. It's just, it's a numbers game. You might have been lucky and, this and that. And real life was scary. So how do they get over that is they make fun of it. But this movie portrays real life, where people were paranoid, where they actually, you saw it in the movie where they blackmailed the actress, and so she turned on her boyfriend or her lover. So yeah, I mean, the whole blackmail aspect, that's scary. What if they get something on your kids? And then you're called into the principal's office, and then they start asking questions about the parents. It's not a pretty society.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. There was even an interesting scene about that when Wiesman goes back to his apartment and the little boy on the elevator says that he's maybe 5 at the most. Yes. And he says, my dad says the Stasi are jerks or something to that effect. And he says, oh, what else did he say? Like that, just... something like that, Well,
and then
culture.
He said, and where do you live? Or what's your father's name?
Yeah,
and then,
exactly.
And then he kind of snapped out of it. He's like, oh, never mind. Yeah. Very powerful scene. Exactly right. There was another one, where they're all having lunch and they're in some sort of cafeteria and 4 of them are joking.
A junior officer tells the joke.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Here's one of them. Yes, I wrote it down. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, so he says... So the guy wakes up and he goes, good morning, dear son. And the son goes, oh, good morning, comrade. And he goes, good morning good morning, or good day, son. And he goes, and in German, you could say all kinds of, good before noon, good afternoon, good evening. Like Germans are very precise with their greetings. So, it's like guten Vormittag, good before noon. And the son goes, oh, good forenoon, comrade. And he says, oh, good, happy noon, son. And the son says, oh, and then he says, later in the day, he says, oh, good evening, son. And he's like, screw you, I'm in the West now. That was and the guy, without even missing a beat, he's like Name, Dienstgrad, Abteilung, like name, rank, and department, or something like that. And I was just like, whoa! And that you could hear a pin drop because suddenly you realize like, oh shoot, we're all kind of having fun, but you can't trust everybody. Somebody's gonna. And then the guy turns around and is like, oh, did you hear the one about Honecker? And whew, yeah. So and then he's laughing, and everybody kind of has this nervous laugh now. But oh yeah, I mean,
did you catch at the end where probably we're skipping around the movie a lot, but this was really, it was one of the, this movie had a lot of really like punchy, powerful parts. At the end, when Wiesman gets busted, his whole job is just opening envelopes. The guy who made that joke was in the desk behind him.
Okay.
I thought that's one of the things that this movie really did. It was, and I don't know if that's a theme of German movies or if that was just this movie in particular, but it would be a scene that would just punch you in the face with power.
Yeah, so like everybody's connected. They're all. It's a small circle of people, and yeah. One thing came to mind just because of the joke. Milan Kundera, who's Czechoslovak, I guess, but Czech, wrote a book called The Joke, which Milan Kundera people know from the, what's it called? The light, something of the eternal mind or whatever. But the thing is, I couldn't even finish that joke. It was so realistic and it's so sad and depressing. I just had to put it down. But someone wrote a joke on a postcard, and then he's in front of the Czechoslovak secret police, and the guy just got his postcard in his hand, and it's like, well, what did you mean by this? You think that's funny? You think socialism's funny? And the whole book was just based. The guy ended up in a gulag, uranium mine or whatever, over a joke. And that's kind of a theme too. That was a theme. That's a theme of oppression. That's part of Czech humor is double meanings that the Austrians wouldn't get under Austria-Hungary. I mean, that's an old part of Czech humor is how do we make fun of the Kaiser without the Germans knowing? And they are the world masters. I mean, Czechs could, totalitarian government can come back anytime. They're like, we lived under the Austrians for 300 years. We lived under the Nazis for 15 years. And we, for the longest, we lived under the Nazis longer than anybody other than Germany. And we lived under communism for 40 years. Do your worst. Like what? I mean, that's like, it's rubbed off on society, this kind of thing.
That was definitely a theme of the movie, is where everybody was walking such a fine line.
Oh, yeah.
You're living the high life. You make the wrong move, you're done.
Mm-hmm. And justice is arbitrary, I think, is kind of a, if the Stasi really has a file on everybody, just in case they want to blackmail somebody, well, is that really justice? Because shouldn't they just be arresting everybody? Isn't everybody a criminal? Or shouldn't they be changing the laws so that everyday citizens aren't criminals? I mean, there's that whole theme, like everybody's a criminal or everybody's a victim. I guess that was some of the criticism that I mentioned before, is that not everybody was Stasi or victim, but in a way, it doesn't take much. It wouldn't take much to become a victim, really. I assume that if you saw someone in a uniform, doesn't matter what uniform, you just kind of put your head down and kind of, try to be respectful and not be like suspicious in any way. Like that's just kind of, that's kind of scary.
A big chunk of this movie was really about the culture, and particularly the artist culture of East Berlin. Now, the main character, Georg Dreimann, he and his friends, they seem to have had a pretty decent lifestyle. He had a library that anybody would envy. He was able to move around fairly freely. He had a TV, decent food. Maybe we can deconstruct some of these things, especially the TV. You mentioned something interesting that I hadn't even really thought about. They could probably pick up West German and West Berlin TV airwaves through their. I mean, what was that sort of thing? What was it like to live in a place like East Berlin in the 80s?
I actually, that's a question I've asked several Czechs, for instance, because I had friends that came from close enough to the border to where they get Austrian channels. And I what is that like? And there's like that was part of the downfall. So first of all, Austrians did that on purpose. I in Munich could perfectly pick up Austrian channels. Munich, southern Germany, fair enough. But I was a ways from the border, a good hour drive or more, and it was on purpose. So after the fall of communism, the Austrians turned down the the amplitude of their signals because. Before it was done on purpose. West Berlin was especially a media hub of TV and radio and all that and they had it turned up, because that way that's how they could get out from the center of GDR. They could send out to most of the country, half the country probably. And I, so I asked him, and that was the answer was like, well, what do you think? You look outside and it's kind of black and white, and you might see a Skoda in Czech Republic. In East Germany, you might see a Trabant or a Warburg or something drive by, and you see the newest BMW commercial and the newest Mercedes commercial, and you're seeing all these TV shows. And you're just like, is that really, it's the 80s. People were watching The Cosby Show in German. And they're like, is that, those black family in the United States has this practically mansion in Manhattan. Is that how the other side lives? Like, and it was the best propaganda we had. We couldn't have done anything better. It was just like, let's crank up the TV station amplitude, send it out a couple, 30 kilometers further. Oh yeah. And that was done on purpose. And I think that in the end, that's what worked more than everybody else. Everybody knew that Levi's and Marlboro existed, and boy, in the 80s, are you kidding me? Have you seen Joe Camel and I want to go smoke cigarettes watching an 80s cigarette commercial, and then they go down to the corner shop and there's some East German, who knows where they get their tobacco from, Cuba or something, and it's just so Coca-Cola and cigarettes and magazines were all top Levi's jeans. Oh my goodness, several $100s a pair, and smuggled in, and it was legal to own them, which means they were worn, and people would see like, oh, that guy must have a connection to West Germany because he's got Nikes, and it was a big deal. That I think was our best propaganda. It was like, look at the stuff we have. As sad as that is in a materialistic culture, we don't think about, or we think of that as a burden, but it helped us defeat communism, that's for sure. With it, beyond a doubt. Oh yeah, like I've had that conversation many a time.
One of the key scenes of the movie was eventually Dryman decides to write this article that we'll talk a little bit more about, but they're tracing people by the font type on their typewriters. Yes. And I mean, obviously in the West, even in 1984, people are using word processors and, early computers. So, I mean, I think even these typewriters they were using were old technology. But eventually they've written this article and they're going to bring it into the West. What was going across that border like?
So that's interesting, yeah, because people did cross the border. And this is what's interesting about East Germany more than other countries is because there's far fewer reasons for a Czech to leave Czechoslovakia. Whereas many East Germans had relatives in West Germany, and it was always this special kind of thing of like, well, we're splitting a country in two, but we know, they're related. They have the same last name. They have the same. It was just much more painful in a way than like turning the whole nation of Poland communist or Hungary communist. In a way, I mean, it was always painful. It was, there was always torture and oppression, crazy oppression and murder, and communism, especially totalitarian communism, was a horrible, horrible thing. But in Germany, it had the added benefit of like separating you from sometimes your parents, your siblings, your cousins, and that kind of thing. And so first of all, there were West Germans that could go to East Germany without many problems because they might have worked there, and there were East Germans that might have worked in the West. And if there was reporters that went back and forth, if I'm not mistaken, some journalists could go back and forth, both East and West, Now that might have gotten locked down, but still, for a while, journalists could at least East journalists could go to West Germany or something like that. Of course, what they wrote would be censored, but there was some issue there where it's like, well, we still need news. We still want to know. Part of the KGB, like the Stasi, the spy apparatus, was through the journalists and this and that. Any diplomatic channel had spy channels. So actually, yeah, there was even ambassadors and. Not for a while, but even East and West Germany eventually had ambassadors going back and forth, and in the 80s, and there were there were few reasons for East Germans to go to West Germany, but there were. If they were famous enough, they would just be allowed to go to the city, and because they'd know they'd come back. High officials could leave. High government officials. General, if you were high enough in the military, they would trust you'd come back because you have a life to come back to, and it wasn't impossible, especially if you were a German, you had relatives on the other side. They'd be like, okay, we'll give you a visa, but you can't take the whole family at once. You have to leave the wife and children behind, and the wife can go too, and the children can go too, but not all at once. Those type of things. So far more than other borders, that Checkpoint Charlie, the east to west Berlin border, was actually an active one, relatively speaking, to the other, Iron Curtain borders. So absolutely. In fact, I've been through East Germany going from West Germany to West Berlin. And, you pull up and my dad with, our family with American passports, and they're like, okay, you have this and this much time to get to the next checkpoint. And then you go, you have, let's say 45 minutes to go whatever, 60 kilometers. I don't know. I don't remember what it was. And then there's checkpoints along the way. And fun story. My dad had a BMW at the time, and he's like, oh, 60 kilometers? I can do that in 30 minutes or whatever. And he stepped on it, and then at some point he took an exit, and we're like, okay, we're in East Germany. And he got back on the Autobahn and made it to the next checkpoint. And that's the time I was illegally in East Germany as a 8-year-old. And then, you get to Checkpoint Charlie, and you're like, all right, well, welcome to West Berlin. And so that existed. And along the Autobahn, there were East German stores. We talked about this on a Bohemian podcast. We had Christophs on and everything. But it started as these like rest areas, these like motels, like trucker stops, where the government realized that this is how you get Deutschmarks and not euros, but this is how you get francs and dollars and Western currency, is by selling them stuff along the way on the Autobahn between West Germany and West Berlin. So, I'm trying to paint a picture of that. It wasn't totally closed off, actually. There were people behind the counter of these things taking Deutschmarks into their pocket. And, so depending on how much corruption was around there, things trickled through. And of course, these shops could sell Coca-Cola to Westerners. But then later, even, people with special IDs and, like diplomats and journalists and those folks. And so Western goods made its way across, and Eastern people made their way across, and it wasn't as closed. It was a more porous border than people would imagine because of how dangerous it could be. But yeah, Germany's interesting in that way for sure. You don't have quite the same stories between Czechoslovakia and Austria, or Hungary and Austria. So yeah.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I was probably in elementary school when this, when the wall fell, and just certainly during the early 80s. And I think as an elementary school person, you had the idea that the Iron Curtain, like there was no cultural diffusion between those two things. Mm-hmm. But there really was. West Germany was in the middle of East Germany.
Yeah, it's super weird. The whole thing is just super weird. Like, I think the further along we move, we're going to look back at this and go, how did that even, why wasn't there just a revolt 20 years earlier? Why didn't they just end it? Because it was so weird. It was really a whole population being held hostage, and there was so much skin in the game from the Russians. If you go back to Moscow, it was like, well, Germany must succeed because That's how we'll prove to the West. They have West Germany, we have East Germany. It must succeed at all cost. And so there was so much skin in the game for the whole Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries. Everybody, Germany was the most successful Soviet country. It was the richest Soviet country. So when if I hear stories from East Germany, it's different even than Prague was pretty well to do. But if I compare that to stories that I've heard in the Ukraine, I mean, I've been to the Ukraine, you can still tell the difference. You can to this day, 2017, when you enter that border from the former Warsaw Pact to the former Soviet Union, you can still tell. But like easily, it's like black and white. So so East Germany was just strange. Like, it's just, why was there the Berlin Wall? Why was there this? And you could totally tell, though. Every once in a while, you get a glimpse of the other side. You'd see a Trabant now and then. So, because I don't know if we even talked about this, people might know me or not, but I grew up in Munich, which at that time was West Germany. And then after college, I moved to Prague. Because I wanted to see how things were changing. And I lived in Prague for 10 years, gathering stories of what it was like under communism. But yeah, now and then you would get a glimpse of, someone, you get a new kid in class and he's like super weird. Like he's a super dork compared, like he doesn't know how to dress. He's kind of dressing like Eastern Europeans. I mean, he just, wearing weird off-brand clothes and not, you could just tell, like, from a mile away. And then you kind of realize, like, oh, they're a refugee, and they'd only be weird for about a month. And they're like, okay, and they snap to, and they're, just blend in with the rest of the West Germans and, catch up on a lot of TV. Just really interesting phenomena. But when it came crashing down, it was a tidal wave. I think you probably have that as a separate bullet point somewhere. But when in Germany they call it Die Wende, the change. When the reunification happened, when the wall collapsed, that's still, it's capital W, Die Wende, like that is when everything happened, and it was just a tidal flood of one way. So where I lived, you just see overnight there was Trabants. And my dad was, picked us up from school and was like, oh my goodness, like world history has happened. Get in the car, off we go. And I was at the Berlin Wall with a hammer and chisel. Like I tore the Berlin Wall down. Not by myself, but I in fact did. Me and my brother as a, 8-year-old and I forget, 8-year-old and 7-year-old or something like that. So we were there, and on the one side, you'd see the tidal wave of East Germans and Trabants and Warburgs and all those East German cars coming over to Munich and everywhere else. But then we actually, we went and peeked through the wall, and as can be seen in like Goodbye Lenin, for instance, like you get a flood of West German brands, you get the billboards, and you get East Germans like buying up Audis and Mercedes and BMWs and Volkswagen and suddenly, just buying anything they can get their hands on, hi-fi stereo systems and TVs and radios, and a flood of stuff came to East Germany to the point where East German companies just went under almost overnight. Whereas in Czechoslovakia, other countries, it wasn't as fast. And they weren't as rich as quick, which means the companies could pivot, and they privatized by giving everybody vouchers with which they could buy stock. And there was a lot of scandal there, a lot of corruption. There's a couple of billionaires to this day still living large in the Bahamas somewhere, who ripped off, thousands of checks in that time, 1993 or so. But they just privatized all the companies, and then the companies still exist. Pilsner and Budvar, the Czech Budweiser, the real one, they both were communist, nationalized companies, and then they got privatized. Skoda was privatized and then bought by VW. So Skoda, the company, still exists. The car manufacturer. Trabant and Warburg are gone. Czech, Pilsner and Budvar still exist, whereas all those little Czech breweries, they're coming back now. There's a lot of nostalgia for that stuff, but you see that in Goodbye Lenin. There's no mention of like Spreewälder pickles and those kind of like nostalgic things in The Life of the Others. There's none of that. like, oh, I miss that brand of pickle I grew up with. It just, yeah, it's like more of a bad, and it's more realistic because East Germans at the time didn't want that stuff. They wanted BMW and they wanted, Western brands. They wanted Japanese TVs. They didn't want, the Russian made whatever it was. So yeah, it was actually more realistic, and it just happened overnight. The East came to the West, and the West came to the East, and then the East disappeared. Long story short.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. This is the end of the first part of this conversation with Travis on the film The Lives of the Others. Look for part 2 soon. Of course, a big thank you goes out to Travis Dow of the Podcastnik group of podcasts, including but not limited to The History of Germany, The Secret Cabinet, Americana für euch, and The History of Alchemy. Links to learn more about Travis can be found at podcastnik.com or in the show notes. I would like to take just a moment for a quick correction. Throughout the episode, I referred to the main character as Wiesmann, where of course his name was Wiesler. I will make mistakes in these episodes, but if I catch them, or if you catch them, I will definitely correct any mistakes that I make. If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to the social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear from you. We can talk about movies, and I would definitely like to hear your ideas for future shows. Please share ideas for movies to cover guests and show topics. They're all greatly appreciated. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. That's ATOZhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. Ratings and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. iTunes reviews also let other people find out more about the show. We'll see you next time beyond the big screen.